As mentioned in the introduction, I'm a PhD student at the AI Music program at Queen Mary's in London. Just a quick plug, I'll put it in at the start. There's a new cohort starting in 2023 in September. And if anyone is interested in doing a PhD in music with machine learning or AI, definitely worth checking them out. And the application's open in December, as far as I'm aware. Okay. So whilst I was on that program, there was a module called Music Programming where we had to do a project on the Bella platform. So this was like my little demo video that I did for that project. So that's the unaffected vocal sample. That's the pitch track with a sine wave following it. That's auto-tuning into a major scale. That's auto-tuning into a major pentatonic. And then back into a minor pentatonic. And then classic transpose. And I think that gives you the rough idea. Yeah, someone said to me earlier, you are going to have an audio demo, right? And I said, oh yeah, of course, quickly edit the slides. So this is in there as just to kind of, to get the feel of what the effect is about. This was done for a coursework project on a deadline, so it's not the finished article. So you'll notice a reference to yin in there. I'll explain that later. But yeah, this is Autotune. You take something and repitch it to some desired set of pitches, and it does so smoothly and deliciously. Right, so how does it actually work? That's what we're all here for. So it's just FFT and stuff, yeah. So here we've got Tom Scott, bless him. He's got a video called, I needn't have done this talk, because he's got a video called How Autotune Works, and it's got 1.7 million views, so it must be right. And so there he is with the subtitles saying the secret is maths called a Fourier transform. So with no spoilers here, but no, it doesn't use Fourier transforms. So the answer is sort of more simple and more complicated. And so that's what we're going to look into today. Just to set out the stall a little bit, I'm just going to go into technical details. I'm not going to do like a cultural history of Autotune or why it was good or bad. Hopefully all the explanations should be simple and straightforward. I'm not going to consider other methods of pitch shifting, although those are interesting. There's a couple of talks tomorrow where people will be diving into those, so I'd recommend checking them out if you're interested after this. And hopefully you'll appreciate the technical achievement that went into Autotune. So that's the kind of goal at the end of the talk. And you should be able to read the patent and know what is going on, because I know the first time that I read this patent, I had no idea what was going on. So this is the original. It's filed in 1998. It's now expired. So plugin developers go nuts. You're free to implement this now. Yeah, and if you can Google for the Autotune patent and check it out for yourselves. It's all there. So we're going to dive into some of that now. So in simple terms, Autotune works. This is on one slide. It treats the circular buffer as a wavetable using an efficient pitch detector to work around overruns and underruns. So we'll just go through and unpack some of those. Some of how it works might surprise you. It might not. We'll just get stuck into it. So first things first, let's just have a quick recap of what a wavetable is. So wavetable, typically you'll pre-calculate some values and store them in a buffer, and then you read through them and copy them to some output. Here, the step that we take in the wavetable is 1, so we're just stepping through the samples in the wavetable one at a time. I've changed it to 1.5 there, and so we're stepping through the wavetable faster, and you can see the output at the in the screen at the bottom here. The period of the waveform is sped up, so this results in the pitch increasing. Hopefully that's clear. You can also see where the sample's fallen at the top. We're in between two samples. So if you've got a step of 1.5, you can interpolate between the values in your wavetable. I'm going to include some links to, if anyone's confused by any of this or I'm going too fast, I'm going to include some links to some good resources at the end of it where you can check these out from scratch. So that's a wavetable for raising pitch. Just quickly for lowering pitch, the principle is very similar. So again, we step through with a step of 1 and effectively copy the output, copy the values to the output. If we take a step of 0.5, we notice that we're kind of proceeding through the wavetable much more slowly, and that results in a lower pitch. So 0.5, it's an octave lower. Okay, wavetables, hopefully straightforward. Just have a quick look at circular buffers. These are widely used in lots of audio processors, so this is teaching my grandmother to suck eggs, as the English phrase goes. And no, I've got no idea what it means either, but it means I'm showing you something that you already know in all likelihood. So similarly, we've got a pretend input at the start. It's a noisy sine wave. We're writing it to a circular buffer of size 50, and basically the oldest value gets overwritten. I mean, this is it's fairly basic stuff, and it's very uninteresting if it's just a write head. It's been written and never read, and there's probably nothing sadder. So one thing that might be sadder is me waiting for it to get to 200 and for something to happen. Okay, are you all excited? Okay, I made these slides too slow. I should have practiced, sorry. We've introduced a read head. It's 40 samples behind the write head, if that makes sense. So it's reading the value from 40 samples prior to the write head. And you can see that it's an exact copy. We started in the middle, but these two peaks here, just after 200 in the output, are aligned to the ones like around 175 in the input. So it's just an exact copy, fine. This is a useful data structure for all kinds of further things. So that's enough of that. Overruns and underruns, what do we mean in this context? So keeping on the idea of a circular buffer, it's the same setup here. Here we've got the read head is advancing faster than the write head. So we're going to get a car crash of some kind where the read head eventually catches up to the write head, as it's about to do now. And we see that, oh no, our output is garbled. We've broken our circular buffer. The boss isn't happy. And so, yeah, the output here you can see is not really of any use to anyone unless you enjoy designing glitchy synthesizers. So that's an overrun. If you move through your circular buffer too quickly, you overtake your write head and you produce kind of discontinuities in the output. So that's not great. Underruns, I'm sure you can predict what's about to happen by now, but our read head is moving far too slowly. And whilst it works, it does work to kind of copy the output at a slower rate, a painfully slower rate. Come on, off we go. Chop, chop. Right, here we go, and it's broken. Yeah, okay. So that's what we want to see in this toy example. It's an example of an underrun. So if we want to change the pitch of a content of a circular buffer using this kind of wavetable style approach, we basically can't do it because, overruns and underruns will get you and the output will be horrible. So how do we fix those? This comes on to kind of the chunkiest bit of the description. The kind of wavetables and circular buffers, I think, are quite familiar to people. Pitch detection is a bit of a beast. It's kind of its own whole field of study. There's probably too much I could say about it, but I just thought I'd kind of make some of the roadmaps in case anyone's kind of interested in digging into it. It can be tricky, suffice to say. So our sort of classic method of doing pitch detection in the time domain is autocorrelation. And so we've got a quote from the patent here at the top left, and he handily gives us the formula that he's using for autocorrelation. I'll just play the video. And whilst the formula might look a bit all that's actually happening is we're stepping through two windows and we're multiplying the values together and then summing them over the size of the window. The terminology we use for the window size is called a lag, because as in it lags behind, it's a time delay. And then in order to work out the pitch, we just test lots of different lags. You just have to go through and check all the possibilities. It's a fairly kind of brute force approach. Down here in the bottom right, you can see the sum of the two dots being, the 2 points where the dots are being multiplied together. And how many more has it got to do? Can I be bothered to wait? Okay, there's one for 80. You'll see that in a second. So we've tested at a lag of size 60, so 60 samples, 65, 70, 75, 80. In actuality, you would test them one at a time. You do every possible lag for the frequency range you're interested in. I should also have said that when you're watching the dots trace through, when it looks like they're moving together across the waveform, that's a good indication that there is a correlation between the two of them. The two windows are similar to each other. So autocorrelation just means we are comparing it to itself. So if we compare it to itself and it's very similar, that means that there is a pitch at that window. There's a pitch where the period is that window size. I should have practiced describing that, but hopefully it'll become clear over time. So our few kind of toy results from the previous slide puts us, if we plot them, it puts us about there. If I use a function from librosa, which is a Python library for doing these things, you can see that the kind of ground truth autocorrelation shows a peak around 70, which is the period of that previous example. And so autocorrelation, there's always a peak at 0. You can have a think about why. It's because if you compare it with itself at 0 with a lag, at 0 lag, it will always be exactly the same. And so typically when we're doing pitch detection, we choose the next peak after the 0 peak. When we talk about lags, we've got a peak. The chosen peak that we're going to have here is a lag of 70. That just means that it's 70 samples long is the period of the waveform. And so to get the frequency, we can divide the sample rate by the period and go back to a frequency in hertz. This is a toy example on a sine wave. Peak picking on real data can be challenging. I'll have an example of that in a second. In terms of the Autotune patent, they use a slightly modified thing, but it's still very similar. It's called the average squared difference function. And you have to calculate two different sums. The top one here, we've got the energy, represented by E, and that's the sum of all the values in the window squared. I'll just play this. The bottom one is the same autocorrelation sum that we did before, so it's the same thing. So you have to calculate both of those for the average square difference function to work. And you can kind of view the energy one at the top, the E, as the kind of perfect version. And then you can view the kind of H as the actual autocorrelation. And so the formula that you use for the average square difference function is to say that for the perfect version, it should be so the perfect version minus twice the actual autocorrelation should be less than a very small number, which is represented as epsilon there. And so what this gives you in pitch tracking terms is a way to measure how periodic a signal is independent of the amplitude of the signal at that time. So this is a good method. Like, there's lots of people who've used this in products for years and years. It's not new. Andy Hildebrand, who wrote the original Autotune, he decided to use it as well. It's kind of well known at the time. And so here's an example of like the whole thing. That is a really terrible display, I'm afraid. Okay, for the benefit of the people in the room, you can just about make out here. There's some points which represent the the chosen lag. But if you can see these bands of color, this is a kind of 3D representation where a dark color represents a, for the average square difference function, we flip it around, and instead of looking for peaks, we're looking for troughs. So the dark color represents a trough, and then these bright colored spots represent a peak. I've got the next slide too. Sorry. That's the audio for this image, but unfortunately the image has not kind of come out quite right in the room. Hopefully the people at home are having a great time now because they can see it properly. So to take one slice at the frame here, where we've got a red line down the left, and we're mapping out the data at that point in time. We've got a dip. Our first dip after 0 is around about 23 samples, and that represents the chosen period, the chosen lag, which is representative of the pitch at that moment in time. We see we've also got a secondary one at a harmonic. That's mentioned in the paper because sometimes the energy at that higher harmonic is actually stronger, and therefore the pitch could be perceived there instead. So you just compare those two and make sure that whichever one is lowest, you choose that as your frequency. Okay, so tying it all together, we've had a little foray into pitch tracking. We go back to our boss with our example of can we repitch an input in a circular buffer without having an overrun. And for some insane reason, I made this really slow. I didn't think about this. Okay, here we go. Here's a read head. It's advancing through slightly faster. I think it's at 1.7 still. And so you can see that the output here at the bottom is a more compact waveform, therefore it's higher in pitch. It's about to overrun the right head, but when we realize that it is, we've detected the pitch of the input, and we jump back by one cycle for exactly one period of the waveform. And in this case, that jumping back, because the pitch track was good, it worked in the output. Now it's funny because it's slightly surprising to people, especially if you've worked in audio for a long time, that the idea of jumping around within a waveform is not something we do very often, shall we say. It feels like it shouldn't work. And so I'll try and address that a little bit later in the talk. And so this is just another extract from the patent. This is the kind of language that he's describing the same concept in the patent. So the method of this invention takes full advantage of precisely determining knowledge of the period of the data. The data is resampled at a new sample rate proportional to the desired change in pitch. In the case of making the pitch sharper, larger sample rate spacing than the input data, the output pointer will occasionally move ahead of the input data pointer. That's an overrun. In which case, exactly one cycle period will be subtracted from the output pointer. This allows the cycle of data to be repeated. In the case of making the pitch flatter, yada, 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 this causes a cycle of data to drop from the output. This resampling approach generates extremely high quality output. So that's the claim in the patent. And it turns out that it does. You know, if your pitch tracker is good enough, you can kind of get away with this, which defies experience and logic. So that's how Autotune works. Welcome to the club. You all know now. The details of it, though, traditional autocorrelation that I displayed there is ON squared. And I like this handy alternative big O notation. So that puts us at the oh my end of the spectrum. Useful if you're, so the human vocal range, in the patent, these are the figures he gives, around 50 hertz for really low notes. Up to around 2,756 hertz for above a soprano's top C. At 44.1, that means we need to examine lags from 16 to 882 samples. So we're going to have to examine each of those lags. That's, when you work out, it's 229 million multiple adds per frame. And Autotune does this every 40 samples. And so that's something like 252 billion multiple adds per second. So it seems unlikely that we're going to get this to work. I have to say those are harsh odds if we do it in the n-squared implementation. So how are we going to get around this? You can use an FFT. I could hear some murmurs of, yeah, you can use an FFT. That is absolutely true, and that's one way that people get around it. But I think actually the optimizations that he does in the patent are definitely worth checking out because he manages to keep it all time domain and do it very efficiently. So this is maybe of interest. Downsampling. So we just said we said about the human vocal range. The human pitch perception range is about 20 hertz to about 5 kilohertz. So we probably don't need such a high sample rate just to kind of determine the pitch. And so what they do in the patent is he downsamples to 5 kilohertz first, and then that means we only need to check between 2 lags to 110 lags, which obviously greatly reduces the computation. It's a factor of 8. The other thing we can take advantage of is that it's very amenable to a sliding window algorithm. So once you've calculated a lag, if you move along by 1 sample point, time t plus 1, then 98 of those calculations are the same. So you've already done those. So if you can cache them, if you can memorize the sum for that lag, you can get away with just calculating one new one on the leading edge and deleting one old one from the trailing edge. And so because it sums and it's amenable to that, we actually, by implementing it as a sliding window, we reduce ON squared to something like ON. Sliding window is not new, but it's useful to know that it can be applied to time domain autocorrelation. And then that will get you decent results, but because you've downsampled, it's not quite as accurate as it could be. So he does a further step, which is once he's figured out the pitch roughly at 5 kilohertz, he focuses in on a narrow neighborhood around his predicted pitch. And he says at the full resolution, if we look 4 lags above and 4 lags below, consider that little neighborhood, and then we recalculate using the full sample rate data, we can do a similar process and get the super precise full resolution pitch, but having only examined 8 more lags than you had to previously. And if you remember the 250 billion or something, this is good for reducing that. With this neighborhood, there's details in the patent where if he finds that the pitch has appeared in the top half of the neighborhood, he shifts the neighborhood up by 1 set of lags. So it's so that the neighborhood kind of tracks the pitch as it moves around, and pitch does move around when in a human vocal performance. So you've got this, you do your sampling at 5 kilohertz, and then this little check afterwards at the full resolution where you track the fine changes in pitch, and that's what allows him to have such an accurate pitch tracker. So the complaint that some people might be thinking is, won't this just make loads of clicking sounds? So this is Robert Bristow Johnson, who wrote the book on wavetables, and he was very scathing about it on DSP Stack Exchange. And he said the pitch detector can't be so good to give you a pitch that will make a non-periodic sound of the portion be periodic. If you make non-overlap jumps from one place in the audio to the other that's unrelated, it will click. Yes, that's true. And the key part of that sentence there is non-periodic. So one thing that helps is that the waveforms are quite consistent from cycle to cycle for the human voice. So jumping backwards by an entire waveform you're kind of likely to land at a roughly similar place. But also in the patent, there's several cases where if a pitch can't be tracked confidently, then the rate just defaults back to 1, so that you know you're not going to get an overrun or an underrun. So if it can't track the pitch, then it's not going to try and advance the read pointer any faster or slower. It will keep lockstep with where it is relative to the right pointer. And so those cases are 54 here. If the signal isn't periodic enough, if it doesn't meet that epsilon value, which is set at 0.4 in the patent, the second one is Lmin and equals 1 or Lmin equals n. That's in this fine neighborhood search. If he ends up at the very bottom of the neighborhood or the very top of the neighborhood, 4 samples either side, he determines that the pitch has varied too rapidly, and therefore we can't be confident about the detection. And then the last one there, 56, is just to say if the energy of the signal is below a minimum level, which is a good sort of sensible thing to do. I thought I was getting a light show there, sorry. Okay, so a couple of conclusions about this. I can't do a talk on Autotune without mentioning T-Pain, but this one, I saw this one, I felt really sorry for him. Apparently Usher just like phoned him up one day and just said, "You've ruined music," and it just sounds so mean. The conclusions, some conclusions we can take from this is that the method is simple. The tricky bit is writing a pitch tracker that works well. You're free to use any pitch tracker. You don't have to use Andy Hildebrand's pitch tracker, but it has to be fast, and you have to do it, regularly in order to have a good enough measure of the pitch for the output for the effect to work. And in implementation-wise, you can implement all of this just using for loops, arrays like modulo on an index and a circular buffer. All the constructs are super simple. There's no FFT libraries. You don't have to pull in any external dependencies. In a sense, you could even teach it to beginners if you can get them to wrap their head around autocorrelation and lags and stuff. Implementation-wise, I wouldn't say it's trivial, but it's certainly not as hard as some other approaches. By the way, I realise I'm kind of speeding through the talks here, but I'm hoping to leave the floor open to a few questions at the end. And there might be questions about kind of pitch tracking or Autotune style effects in general. Hopefully I can help with those. The second part of my conclusion is, if you think about it, Autotune kind of allows us to manipulate pitch as opposed to timbre. And a lot of what we do as audio engineers focuses in the world of manipulating timbre. But pitch is this other important component. And I think Autotune itself and other kind of pitch correction tools are interesting, and they often get typecast as like, it's this specific effect, it sounds like this, it's used in music I'm not into, or something along those lines. But I think there are actually lots of use cases for it that are underexplored, partly because there aren't any good open source implementations of Autotune and it's not been kind of riffed on and copied as much. But also because I think we're guilty of maybe dismissing it and pigeonholing it slightly. I've got a picture of Daft Punk there because I've got my own pet theory that if you listen to the Discovery album, I think they used Autotune on every single track in one place or another, and not just for vocals. So whereas like the vocal for One More Time is like obviously Autotuned, like that's the classic sound of Autotune. I think you can find it in places like, again, this is my pet theory. I've not spoken to Daft Punk, but it's hard. Hard to get hold of them before my talk. My theory is that Harder, Better, Faster, Stronger was, for my mind, was probably a vocoder in a narrow pitch range, and that the crazy kind of piano solo bit that everyone loves was that same sample put through Autotune. I think that the amazing guitar solo at the end of Digital Love, I think that was a distorted guitar that was then put through Autotune and manipulated with a keyboard. I mean, I could be wrong, but I think if you go back and check it out, like, there's an argument to be made for it. And there is a quote from one of Daft Punk and said, "We use Autotune in a way it wasn't designed to work. People are often afraid of things that sound new." So I think there's like definitely, even though it's like, whatever it is, 17 years old now, 18 years old, I think we could still revisit it and just kind of build this into our effects and build kind of pitch-dependent effects that could do new things, make new sounds. Okay, approaching the end. This is some links to various resources. Thanks very much to Andrew, who's sat there. He's the author of most of these resources, and he runs the Bella team at Queen Mary currently, and has some incredible resources for beginning programmers using C++ for Bella. If you don't have a Bella, you can still use it. You can still learn from it. It's fantastic. Pitch detection, there's a good summary paper there. It's from 2004, but a lot of it still applies. A couple of articles at the end going into the kind of the history and folklore of Autotune, which is also interesting. Yeah, so I should have practiced this talk. I think that's kind of clear from my presentation. I've left a little bit of time at the end here, but thank you very much. You can, yeah, sorry. Yeah, thank you. Thanks. I was just going to add, if you've got any follow-up questions, particularly the people at home online, catch me in the ADC Discord, or if you come up with a question next week, as you know, I'm sure someone's bound to. I'm available on Twitter at Xavier Riley, and then my email address is there for anyone who wants me. Yeah, and hopefully open the floor to questions, maybe.